I've made myself clear. If your name isn't on the list, you'll need to leave. Otherwise, I'll call security. A tall man in a black suit and earpiece stepped forward. His name tag read, Musa. His stance wasn't aggressive, but firm. Madam, this way, please. Zoey stood frozen. A few guests had turned now, curiosity sparkling in their eyes. Someone nearby pulled out a phone. She wasn't sure if they were filming, but the shame burned regardless. She could hear the murmurs. She doesn't belong here. Some motion girl probably forged the invite. I blame social media. Everyone wants to be an influencer. I didn't know the invitation wasn't transferable, Zoey said quickly, trying to steady her voice even as tears stung her eyes. Scarlett didn't tell me. I wasn't trying to sneak in. I just wanted to speak to someone about my sister's dialysis. Musa gently touched her elbow. Madam, he said again, his voice firm, please. The contact startled her, just enough that she stumbled back a step. The crowd seemed to shift away from her, like oil repelling water. She was a smudge on the glittering glass of this world. The humiliation was total. She was halfway down the steps when someone's champagne glass clinked behind her. She turned one last time to glance through the golden doors. The chandeliers glowed like cruel stars. Laughter floated out. It wasn't just rejection. It was rejection by a world that had never been made for people like her. The invitation slipped from her hand, landing on the ground. Just in time for a man in crocodile skin loafers to step on it. He didn't notice, or didn't care. Zoey picked it up slowly, brushing it off even though it was already ruined. She had known this would be hard, but she hadn't expected it to feel like being exposed, stripped of dignity in front of people who saw her as less than human. For a moment, she stood still under the bright hotel lights, breathing shallowly. She wanted to scream or run or melt into the pavement. But she didn't do any of those things. She thought of Rebecca hooked up to a dialysis machine, still fighting to live. Zoey wiped her tears with the back of her hand. I'm not done, she whispered to herself. She had failed to enter tonight, but this would not be the end. The red carpet outside the Marriott Hotel was still bustling. Guests shimmered in velvet, silk, and designer igbatas. But all eyes had shifted not toward the glamour, but toward a woman standing awkwardly under the security lights. Her eyes red, her hands clenched around a worn handbag, her pride visibly fraying. Zoey Obika stood outside in her pinned navy gown, her cheeks burning as laughter and champagne clinks echoed from within. Her invitation had been crushed not just physically, but symbolically by the same polished shoes she had tried so hard to match. She hadn't belonged inside that world. That much was clear. The security guard, Musa, stood nearby, his face impassive. Madam, please, let's not make this any more difficult than it already is. Zoey didn't respond. She couldn't. Her voice had been swallowed by humiliation. A few curious guests still lingered, watching her like an unwelcome act in a show they hadn't paid for. A phone camera blinked in the distance. And then, a voice sliced through the murmurs, deep and unmistakable. What's going on here? Everything paused. Conversations halted. Glasses stopped midair. Zoey turned toward the voice, her heart skipping a beat. A sleek black 2023 Range Rover autobiography had just pulled up, and from it stepped a tall man in a tailored black tuxedo and matching velvet slippers, his gait calm and deliberate, his posture rigid with quiet power. His face was unmistakable, strong jawline, piercing eyes, and the gravitas of someone who had never once needed to raise his voice to be heard. Wendell Kingston Danjuma, CEO of Danjuma Group Holdings, the very man whose foundation was hosting the gala. A Lagos Titan, he stepped toward the small crowd that had formed outside. His eyes swept over them, cool and assessing, before they landed on Zoey. She froze. Her throat closed. She had never met him in her life, but something in his eyes made it seem like he knew her, as if he were seeing someone he'd been trying to remember. And then, with the confidence of a man used to bending perception and power to his will, Kingston said, "She's my wife." The scent of sizzling akara and burnt stew clung stubbornly to Zoey Obika's braids as she rushed between tables at Scarlett's Bistro, a modest but bustling cafe in Surulere, Lagos. The morning rush was at its peak, filled with loud bankers on quick breaks and Okada riders refueling before the afternoon heat. At 26, Zoey moved through the chaos with a rhythm she had long perfected, balancing a tray of yam and egg sauce in one hand while refilling mugs of instant coffee with the other. Her apron was faded, her sneakers had holes, but her smile never faltered, not because she enjoyed the job, but because the tips paid for Rebecca's hospital bills, and those bills were the only thing standing between her sister and a slow death. A wall clock above the counter read 10:47 a.m., 4 more hours until her shift ended. Then she'd jump a BRT bus to Victoria Island for her second job tutoring teenagers in math. Between both jobs, Zoey barely had time to breathe. But every naira she earned had one purpose: keeping Rebecca, her older sister, alive. Rebecca, at 32, was now too weak to work. Every day she was tethered to a dialysis machine in their one-bedroom apartment in Machin. The transplant list was a long, bureaucratic mess, and the so-called HMO, it barely covered half the cost. Zoey had done the math. Every kobo counted. Even with all she'd saved, they were still short by over 120 million. That number haunted her, even in her sleep. "Order up," bellowed Chief Tunde, the head cook, snapping Zoey out of her thoughts. She grabbed a plate of boiled plantain and catfish pepper soup and maneuvered past Scarlett Okan, her best friend and colleague. Scarlett was a whirlwind of joy, her ponytail bouncing as she chatted up customers while wiping tables. A second-year mass communication student at the University of Lagos, Scarlett juggled school and shifts like it was nothing. "Z!" Scarlett called during a lull in the noise. She leaned against the counter, her brown eyes gleaming with concern. "You look like you're carrying the whole of Lagos on your back. When last did you sleep?" Zoey wiped her hands on her apron, offering a weak smile. "Sleep is a luxury, my friend. You know that." Scarlett's expression softened. She knew all about Rebecca, about the hospital bills, about the nights Zoey spent calculating how much oxygen cost in this country. "You need to take care of yourself too. You're the only one Rebecca has." "I'm fine," Zoey whispered, though her voice shook. Fine was the lie she told herself every morning. She turned to clear a table, but Scarlett caught her wrist. "Wait, I have something for you." She rummaged through her bag and pulled out a cream-colored envelope with shimmering gold edges. The envelope looked so out of place in the greasy cafe. It was like a Rolls-Royce parked in the middle of a shoddy. "Oh, what's this?" Zoey asked, taking the heavy envelope made of expensive cardstock. "An invitation to the Danjuma Foundation Gala tomorrow night. It's at the Marriott in Victoria Island. All the Lagos elite will be there," Scarlett said, eyes wide. "The invite was given to me for making first class, but I just got accepted into an exchange program in Ghana. I'm flying out tomorrow morning. So, go." Zoey blinked. She pictured long gowns, men in agbadas sipping champagne, and rich couples discussing their next investment over grilled prawns. That wasn't her world. "Scarlett, be serious. I can't go to a gala. I don't belong there." "That's exactly why you should go," Scarlett said, her voice firm. "The event is hosted by Danjuma Group Holdings. That's Kingston Danjuma's company. Billionaires will be there. You might just speak to the right person. A grant, a sponsor, anything. You said you'd do anything to help Rebecca. This could be your anything." Zoey ran her fingers along the gold trim of the envelope. She wasn't a socialite. She didn't own a designer dress. She barely knew how to pronounce hors d'oeuvres. But Scarlett's words planted a stubborn seed in her chest. "What would I even say?" she murmured. "And the invitation has your name on it." Scarlett waved her off. "No one checks ID at these things. Just flash the card, act like you know where you're going, and walk in. Confidence is half the battle." Zoey still wasn't sure, but Scarlett's belief in her was hard to resist. She tucked the invitation into her apron, her heart racing. "Fine, I'll go. But if I embarrass myself, I'm blaming you forever." Scarlett laughed and pulled her into a tight hug. "You'll be amazing, Z. You always are." That night, Zoey sat at their worn-out kitchen table, lit by a single flickering bulb. The quiet hum of Rebecca's dialysis machine filled the room. Her sister lay on the couch, her skin pale, her eyes shut. She looked peaceful, but Zoey knew how much pain she endured each day. They had lost their parents in a road accident 8 years ago. Since then, it had been just the two of them. Rebecca, the big sister who used to braid Zoey's hair and teach her Yoruba proverbs, was now too tired to even laugh. Zoey opened the envelope carefully. The invitation inside gleamed with elegant calligraphy. You are cordially invited to the annual Danjuma Foundation Charity Gala in support of public health and medical research. Venue, Marriott Hotel, Victoria Island. Lagos dress code. Formal date, tomorrow evening. She stared at it, her hands trembling. Victoria Island, a place she had only visited for job interviews or tutoring rich kids in their parents' living rooms. She had never stepped into the Marriott, never been invited to anything that didn't involve jollof rice in a plastic cooler. Scarlett's voice echoed in her mind. They've got money, Z. Zoey didn't know how to pitch herself, but she wouldn't let fear get in the way. She powered up her laptop, its fan groaning like an old generator, and opened a blank Word document. She typed out a simple summary of Rebecca's condition, the hospital bills, the transplant cost, and their struggle. It wasn't a formal proposal, but it was something she could hand to someone if she got the chance. She printed it on the last sheet of paper in the tray and folded it neatly into her handbag. Next came the dress. Her wardrobe consisted of second-hand jeans and faded blouses. But Rebecca had a navy blue gown tucked away, the one she wore to her friend's wedding before her health collapsed. Zoey tried it on. It was a bit loose, and the hem was frayed, but it was her only shot. She pinned the waist with safety pins, tied her braids into a neat bun, and practiced a smile in the cracked bathroom mirror. That smile felt like armor, fragile but necessary. As she lay in bed staring up at the peeling ceiling, doubt began to creep in. What was she doing? Crashing a billionaire's gala with a borrowed name and a hope that felt like a whisper? But then she remembered Rebecca's soft laugh. The way she said, "Don't ever give up on me, Z." For Rebecca, she would go. For her sister, Zoey Obika would walk into a world she didn't belong to, holding an invitation that didn't bear her name. And maybe, just maybe, she'd find someone willing to save a life. The towering glass facade of the Marriott Hotel in Victoria Island shimmered under the Lagos evening sky, its white lights glowing like stars caught in steel. Sleek black Range Rovers and luxury sedans lined the driveway as elegantly dressed guests stepped out onto the red-carpeted entrance. Women in sequin gowns and gel spoke in practiced tones, while men in tuxedos or white agbadas shook hands like they were closing billionaire deals. Just a few feet away, Zoey Obika stood on the sidewalk, her heart thudding so loudly it was all she could hear. In her borrowed navy gown, held together with safety pins, and the only heels she owned, slightly chipped, she looked nothing like the people floating effortlessly up the marble steps. But she clutched the cream-colored invitation tightly in her hand like it was a lifeline. She took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "This is for Rebecca." The single page she had printed, the one outlining her sister's health crisis and the $120 million needed, was folded carefully in her handbag alongside her ID and her last N2000. Summoning courage she didn't feel, Zoey climbed the stairs. Inside, the lobby was magnificent. Sparkling chandeliers dangled from the high ceilings, casting a golden glow on the marble floors. Waiters in white jackets served champagne on silver trays. A string quartet played softly near the grand staircase. Everything gleamed, glass, laughter, and power. She stepped into the check-in line, keeping her chin high, even as her stomach twisted. The scent of jasmine and expensive perfume filled the air. People were laughing, mingling. Not a single soul looked like they had just taken a BRT bus from Mushin. When it was her turn, she approached the registration desk, where a poised woman in a sleek black jumpsuit and bold red lipstick stood holding an iPad. A name tag gleamed on her chest. Chimamanda. Zoey offered the invitation with both hands, trying to smile. Chimamanda took the card, scanned it, then looked up at Zoey. Her eyes took in the frayed hem of the gown, the cheap shoes, and the slight tremor in her hands. The smile on Chimamanda's face was polite, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Your name, madam?" she asked. "Zoey Obika." Chimamanda tapped the iPad slowly. Then again. Her brows drew slightly together. She looked back at the invitation, then at Zoey, her gaze narrowing. "This ticket is issued to Scarlett Oaken," she said coolly, "and I'm afraid it's non-transferable." Zoe's heart dropped. She swallowed, her voice shaking. "Scarlett is my friend. She gave it to me. She couldn't attend because of a school program. She told me it would be fine." "I'm sorry," Chimamanda said, her tone clipped now, professional but distant. "This is a strictly by-invitation event. No name, no entry, protocol." Zoe's face flushed. She opened her mouth to explain, to beg, but another woman nearby in a gold gown and diamond necklace turned to her partner and whispered, loudly enough to be heard, "She probably thinks this is a wedding reception with free small chops." The man beside her chuckled, not even trying to hide it. Zoe's hands trembled. "Please," she said, her voice low but desperate. "I'm not here to cause any trouble. I just need to speak to someone. Anyone. My sister. She's sick. I came hoping to find help. I promise. I'll leave right after." But Chimamanda didn't soften. "I've made myself clear. If your name isn't on the list, you'll need to leave. Otherwise, I'll call security." A tall man in a black suit and earpiece stepped forward. His name tag read, Musa. His stance wasn't aggressive, but firm. "Madam, this way, please." Zoe stood frozen. A few guests had turned now, curiosity sparkling in their eyes. Someone nearby pulled out a phone. She wasn't sure if they were filming, but the shame burned regardless. She could hear the murmurs. "She doesn't belong here. Some mushin girl probably forged the invite." "I blame social media. Everyone wants to be an influencer." "I didn't know the invitation wasn't transferable," Zoe said quickly, trying to steady her voice even as tears stung her eyes. "Scarlett didn't tell me. I wasn't trying to sneak in. I just wanted to speak to someone about my sister's dialysis." Musa gently touched her elbow. "Madam," he said again, his voice firm, "please." The contact startled her, just enough that she stumbled back a step. The crowd seemed to shift away from her, like oil-repelling water. She was a smudge on the glittering glass of this world. The humiliation was total. She was halfway down the steps when someone's champagne glass clinked behind her. She turned one last time to glance through the golden doors. The chandeliers glowed like cruel stars. Laughter floated out. It wasn't just rejection. It was rejection by a world that had never been made for people like her. The invitation slipped from her hand, landing on the ground. Just in time for a man in crocodile-skin loafers to step on it. He didn't notice, or didn't care. Zoe picked it up slowly, brushing it off even though it was already ruined. She had known this would be hard, but she hadn't expected it to feel like being exposed, stripped of dignity in front of people who saw her as less than human. For a moment, she stood still under the bright hotel lights, breathing shallowly. She wanted to scream or run or melt into the pavement. But she didn't do any of those things. She thought of Rebecca hooked up to a dialysis machine, still fighting to live. Zoe wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "I'm not done," she whispered to herself. She had failed to enter tonight, but this would not be the end. The red carpet outside the Marriott Hotel was still bustling. Guests shimmered in velvet, silk, and designer igbatas, but all eyes had shifted not toward the glamour, but toward a woman standing awkwardly under the security lights. Her eyes red, her hands clenched around a worn handbag, her pride visibly fraying. Zoey Obika stood outside in her pinned navy gown, her cheeks burning as laughter and champagne clinks echoed from within. Her invitation had been crushed not just physically, but symbolically by the same polished shoes she had tried so hard to match. She hadn't belonged inside that world. That much was clear. The security guard, Musa, stood nearby, his face impassive. "Madam, please, let's not make this any more difficult than it already is." Zoe didn't respond. She couldn't. Her voice had been swallowed by humiliation. A few curious guests still lingered, watching her like an unwelcome act in a show they hadn't paid for. A phone camera blinked in the distance. And then, a voice sliced through the murmurs, deep and unmistakable. "What's going on here?" Everything paused. Conversations halted. Glasses stopped midair. Zoe turned toward the voice, her heart skipping a beat. A sleek black 2023 Range Rover autobiography had just pulled up, and from it stepped a tall man in a tailored black tuxedo and matching velvet slippers, his gait calm and deliberate, his posture rigid with quiet power. His face was unmistakable, strong jawline, piercing eyes, and the gravitas of someone who had never once needed to raise his voice to be heard. Wendell, or Kingston Danjuma, CEO of Danjuma Group Holdings, the very man whose foundation was hosting the gala. A Lagos Titan, he stepped toward the small crowd that had formed outside. His eyes swept over them, cool and assessing, before they landed on Zoe. She froze. Her throat closed. She had never met him in her life, but something in his eyes made it seem like he knew her, as if he were seeing someone he'd been trying to remember. And then, with the confidence of a man used to bending perception and power to his will, Kingston said, "She's my wife." Silence. The kind of silence that makes time itself hold its breath. Musa blinked. "Sir?" "She's my wife," Kingston repeated. Slower now, his tone calm but deadly. "And I suggest everyone start treating her with the respect she deserves." Zoe's mouth parted. She didn't speak. Couldn't. "What?" Whispers rippled through the crowd. "Did he just say, wife? I thought he was single." Kingston Danjuma. Married? When? Chimamanda, the check-in lady, looked like she had swallowed a fly. Her fingers hovered above the tablet, useless now. "Mr. Danjuma," she stammered. The name on the invitation was—" "I don't care whose name was on the invitation," he said, cutting her off. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried weight, enough to silence an entire ballroom. "She's with me. That should be enough." Chimamanda backed away, stunned. Even Musa stepped aside. Zoe was trembling. Her feet were cemented to the marble steps. Her mind screamed, "What is happening?" She wasn't his wife. She didn't even know him. But he had said it in front of everyone. Kingston walked over and stopped just a foot away. He leaned in slightly, his voice now soft, intimate, just for her ears. "Go along with it," he said. "Please." And before she could think, before she could question, he extended his arm to her. Automatically, Zoe took it. His hand was warm, steady. And just like that, they walked together through the tall glass doors of the Marriott Hotel, the same doors that had been shut against her minutes ago. The crowd inside turned to look. Conversations died. Even the band seemed to play softer. She could feel hundreds of eyes burning into her. Kingston's wife? But he didn't flinch. He walked like he owned the place, which, in many ways, he did. Zoe glanced sideways at him, trying to read his expression. He looked calm, composed, like nothing unusual had happened. She, on the other hand, felt like she was in a fever dream. A few steps later, he led her down a side corridor lined with gold-trimmed mirrors and soft lighting. At the end, he opened a door and ushered her into a small private lounge, away from the main event. Zoe stepped inside and turned to face him the moment the door closed. "Mr. Danjuma," she stammered. "What just happened? Why did you say I was your wife?" He didn't sit. He paced for a moment before turning to her, his tone gentle now. "Because 2 years ago, you saved someone very important to me." Zoe blinked. "What?" "My son," Kingston said. "Kevin. He had a severe allergic reaction in Freedom Park during a school event. People panicked, teachers froze. You were there. You knew what to do?" She gasped softly. The memory surged back, a little boy turning blue, choking, gasping for air. She'd used the EpiPen in his bag. She hadn't even waited for help, just acted. "I remember," she whispered. "I searched for you after that," he said, "but you disappeared. No name, No contact, just a memory of a woman who saved my son. Zoe's hand went to her mouth. I, I didn't think it mattered. I just did what anyone would have done. No, he said, stepping closer. You did what most people couldn't, and I'll never forget it. Her voice trembled. But calling me your wife? That's extreme. Kingston looked at her, his eyes dark with something between gratitude and anger. I saw how they treated you outside, like trash, like you didn't belong. I wasn't going to let that happen again. The fastest way to shut them up was to claim you. Zoe stood still. Her heart thundered. She didn't know what to say. I'm sorry if I embarrassed you, Kingston added, but I couldn't stand by. Not again. She took a shaky breath, then smiled barely. You called me your wife to protect me from snobs. That's kind of romantic in a very illegal-sounding way. He laughed softly. Maybe a little. Then he offered his hand again. Come back in, as my guest. No one will question you now. Zoe hesitated, but the weight of her sister's life was still on her shoulders. This night had been about finding hope, not running from it. She nodded. Okay, she said. And this time, when they stepped into the ballroom, every head turned. But Zoe didn't look down. Not anymore. The grand ballroom of the Marriott Hotel in Victoria Island shimmered like something out of a dream. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected soft golden light from chandeliers that glittered like stars, while violins played a melody so delicate it felt like silk brushing against the skin. Waiters glided between guests with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Conversations buzzed softly, a symphony of power, prestige, and privilege. But Zoey Obika heard none of it. She was walking beside Kingston Danjuma, the man who had just declared her his wife, in front of dozens of Lagos's most elite. Her legs moved on instinct, but her mind was spinning. People were staring, she could feel their eyes scanning her, from her pinned dress to her confused expression. Phones were subtly being raised for photos. The whispers were everywhere. Is that his wife? I thought he was divorced. She doesn't look like one of them. Kingston didn't flinch. His tall frame cut confidently through the crowd, his hand resting gently on the small of Zoe's back. Firm, respectful, and oddly grounding. His face remained calm, his chin slightly raised, his steps steady. He leaned in and whispered just loud enough for her to hear, You're doing great. Just breathe. Zoe gave a tiny nod, though her palms were sweating. Her throat was dry. She wanted to disappear into the ground. Instead, Kingston led her past the clinking glasses and stairs, toward a quieter hallway that veered off from the main ballroom. Thick carpeting softened their steps. Ornate paintings of Lagos skyline lined the walls. The music faded as they reached a smaller room, a VIP lounge. He pushed open the door and gestured for her to enter. And inside it was quiet, warm. A plush velvet sofa faced a low marble table. Through the window, the lights of Victoria Island twinkled like a sea of stars. The clamor of the gala felt miles away. For the first time since that night began, Zoe exhaled. She turned to him, clutching her handbag like it might hold her sanity. Mr. Danjuma, I really need to understand what's going on, she said, her voice trembling but firm. You said I saved your son's life, but I don't remember ever meeting you. Kingston remained by the window, one hand in his pocket. He looked out at the city before slowly turning to face her. His eyes weren't piercing, now they were softer, shadowed by something more vulnerable. 2 years ago, he said, Freedom Park. My son Kevin was there with his school. I was just arriving for a meeting when I heard screams. He was on the ground not breathing. No one moved, people panicked. But you didn't. Zoe blinked. The memory was foggy, but then, like a picture emerging in a darkroom, it clicked. A small boy, a peanut allergy, his tiny hands clutching his throat, his lips turning blue. She remembered diving into his backpack, finding the EpiPen, and pressing it into his thigh as she'd been taught in a free first aid class years ago. She'd held his hand and whispered, You're okay. You're a superhero. I remember, she said softly, But I didn't know he was your son. Kingston stepped forward, his voice low. You saved his life, Miss Obika, and then you disappeared before I could even thank you. No name, no contact. Zoe shook her head. I didn't think it was anything important. I was just trying to help. You don't know what it meant to me, he said, to Kevin. After that, I looked everywhere for you. I sent people to ask around the park, posted on forums, nothing. I only remembered your face, and when I saw you tonight standing outside, I knew. Zoe felt her heart squeeze. Her knees were weak, but she stayed standing. I really wasn't expecting any of this, she whispered. I came here for something else. For my sister. Kingston's brows lifted slightly. Zoe hesitated, then decided she had nothing left to lose. She opened her handbag and took out the folded paper, the summary she'd written about Rebecca's condition. My sister's on dialysis. The transplant costs are beyond what I can manage. I thought maybe if I met someone here who had influence, or a foundation, someone might help. She handed the paper to Kingston, her fingers trembling. That's why I came, not to pretend, not to steal anyone's place. He took the page, read it silently, then looked back at her. You shouldn't have had to beg to be heard, he said, and you definitely shouldn't have been humiliated. Zoe looked down, her cheeks burning. I didn't want to cause a scene. I just hoped. Kingston walked over to the table and set the paper down gently. Then he turned back to her. I owe you a debt I can never repay, but if you'll allow it, I'd like to try. Her breath hitched. What do you mean? He studied her face like he was trying to solve a mystery. Kevin hasn't smiled like that in a long time. When I saw him tonight, and he looked at you, Kingston's voice dropped. You gave him something I couldn't buy: safety, comfort, trust. Zoe's throat tightened. He remembered me? Kingston nodded, vividly. A quiet beat passed between them. Then he said gently, you still don't have to stay, but if you do, I'd like you to be my guest tonight. No more lies, just truth. Your truth. Zoe stared at him, this powerful, wealthy man whose world she had never imagined being part of, and she realized something strange. She didn't feel judged. She felt seen. I'll stay, she said at last, voice soft but steady. For Kevin, for my sister. Kingston's expression barely shifted, but something in his shoulders relaxed. He nodded once, then stepped aside and opened the door for her. Let's reintroduce you to the room properly. As they walked out, side by side, this time Zoe didn't worry about the frayed hem of her dress or the whispers waiting for her beyond the lounge. This time she walked tall. The ballroom of the Marriott Hotel was bathed in gold. Chandeliers shimmered above a sea of Lagos's elite. Senators' wives, tech billionaires, oil magnates, and old money aristocrats who walked with the ease of people born into power. But Zoey Obika barely noticed any of them. She stood near the edge of the ballroom beside Kingston Denjuma, the man who had just redefined her entire night, and maybe her life. Her dress, still pinned at the waist, clung awkwardly to her frame. Her flats felt out of place among the glossy Louboutins and Italian leather loafers. Yet somehow she didn't feel invisible anymore. Kingston handed her a flute of champagne. Relax, he murmured. They're just curious. She took a careful sip. The bubbles tickled her nose and made her wince. It was bitter and crisp, nothing like the sweet malt drinks she sometimes shared with Rebecca on good days. Before she could find her footing in this strange new space, a child's high-pitched voice cut through the room. Daddy! Daddy! Zoe turned toward the sound and froze. A small boy in a tiny black tuxedo with a slightly crooked bow tie was darting toward them with all the confidence of a prince in his castle. His black curls bounced as he ran, and his wide, expressive eyes were a mirror of Kingston's. Kevin Denjuma. He stopped right in front of her, stared hard for a moment, then gasped. You're the lady from the park, he shouted joyfully. Zoe's mouth parted. I remember you, Kevin exclaimed, his little hands gripping the hem of her dress. You gave me the shot and said I was a superhero." Around them, murmurs began to ripple. Faces turned, expressions shifted from mild curiosity to stunned surprise. She saved Kevin? She's that woman? Even a few waiters paused mid-tray. Zoey crouched instinctively, her hands hovering just above his shoulders. "You remember me?" Kevin nodded furiously, a huge grin on his face. "You said I didn't need a cape to be a superhero. I told Daddy all the time, but he couldn't find you." Then without another word, he threw his little arms around her neck. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Across the ballroom, a few people exchanged knowing glances. One older woman with a diamond-studded gel pressed a hand to her chest. "Bless her," she whispered. A younger man in an ash-colored suit pulled out his phone. "That's her? The woman who saved Kevin Danjuma?" Zoe's heart swelled and tightened at once. She wasn't used to being looked at this way. Not like a problem, not like a waitress, but like a miracle. Kevin pulled back slightly, looking up at her. "You're my superhero." Zoey blinked away sudden tears and smoothed his curls gently. "You're the brave one. You've grown so much." He beamed. "Want to see my favorite cupcake? It's pink." Before she could respond, he grabbed her hand and pulled her across the room toward the dessert table. "Come, come, come," he sang, skipping slightly. Zoey followed, letting herself laugh softly for the first time that night. From a distance, Kingston stood still, watching the two of them. His champagne glass hung forgotten in his hand, his expression unreadable, but his eyes burned with something intense. A woman in a crimson silk gown approached him from the side. Her dark weave was slicked back, and her voice was low but pointed. "Daniel," she began. He didn't correct her. "She's beautiful," the woman said carefully, glancing toward Zoey. "But she's not one of us. Is she really your wife?" Kingston took a sip of his drink, then looked the woman in the eye. "She's the one who saved Kevin's life," he said coolly. "That's all you need to know." And with that, he walked away. At the dessert table, Kevin was gleefully explaining the difference between strawberry and raspberry icing. "Try this one," he insisted, pointing to a cupcake topped with pink frosting and edible glitter. "It's magical." Zoey smiled and broke off a tiny piece. "Mmm, sweet." Kevin giggled. "Did you save more people after me? Are you still a superhero?" She laughed softly. "No, Kevin. I just try to help when I can." "You helped me," he said with utter conviction. "I was scared. Then you came." He climbed into a chair and began telling her about his school, his favorite cartoon, and how his dad let him eat ice cream on weekends. His voice bubbled with excitement, and Zoey listened like every word was gold. It wasn't the gala. It wasn't the dresses. It wasn't even Kingston. It was this moment. This little boy who remembered her, not for what she wore, but for how she made him feel. Kingston eventually approached, his tall figure casting a long shadow over the table. "Kevin, don't tire Miss Zoey out." "I'm not," Kevin insisted. "She likes cupcakes too." Kingston raised a brow, his gaze softening as it met Zoey's. "Everything okay?" Zoey smiled faintly. "He's a star." Kingston nodded. "He doesn't warm up to people easily, especially not since everything." Zoey looked up at him, sensing there was more behind those words than he said aloud. "He's doing amazing," she said softly. "You've done well." But Kingston shook his head. "You're the one doing something right. Look at him." There was a strange energy between them now, gentle, layered, unspoken. Kevin tugged Zoey's hand. "Will you stay for dinner?" "Daddy says we're going to a special restaurant after." Zoey glanced up, unsure. Kingston answered for her. "If she'd like to, then yes." Zoey smiled at Kevin and squeezed his tiny fingers. "For tonight," she said, "I'll stay." The music had softened, and the lights in the Marriott ballroom had dimmed to a golden haze. Guests began to file out in pairs, their conversations trailing off into laughter and soft goodbyes. Waiters collected glasses while the string quartet packed away their instruments. But Zoey Obika still stood in the far corner of the ballroom, quietly watching the glittering crowd thin out. She held her handbag close to her chest, her nerves starting to settle, the edges of disbelief still lingering like perfume. Tonight, she had walked into a world that had never been built for someone like her. And yet here she was. Kevin Danjuma, now yawning and leaning against his father's leg, was moments from falling asleep. His bow tie had slid down to his chest, and his curly hair was tousled from dancing around the dessert table. But he looked peaceful. Happy. Kingston. Danjuma knelt beside him, gently lifting him into his arms. "Let's get you home, champ," he said quietly. A woman in a black uniform stepped forward from the side, Kevin's nanny, and took him with care. Kingston watched them leave, then turned back toward Zoey. "He won't make it through dessert," he said. "He's out." Zoey smiled. "He's adorable. And he really loves you." Kingston nodded, slipping his hands into his pockets. "I try," he said. "Parenting is mostly trying and praying." He looked at her. "Let me take you home." Zoey shook her head. "That's kind, but not necessary. I can manage. I'll take a Bolt, or a Danfo if I need to." Kingston arched a brow. "Danfo? At midnight? I don't think so. Come on, my car's out front." Zoey hesitated, but something in his tone made it difficult to refuse. It wasn't forceful, it was protective. She nodded. They stepped into the warm Lagos night together. A cool breeze blew over Victoria Island, and the quiet hum of traffic floated from afar. Kingston's sleek black Range Rover waited at the entrance. The driver opened the door, and Zoey slid in, still overwhelmed by the scent of leather and air conditioning. For a while, the car was silent. Lagos lights passed by in a blur outside the tinted windows, brilliant, chaotic, alive. But inside the vehicle, there was only the soft hum of the engine and the quiet rhythm of Kingston's fingers tapping against the steering wheel. Then Zoey spoke. "I wasn't supposed to be there tonight," she said. Kingston glanced at her. She continued, her voice gentle. "The invitation belonged to Scarlett, my best friend. She got it from her department at Humiliated and gave it to me. She believed maybe someone at the Gala could help me. And honestly, I went because I didn't know what else to do." She paused, then reached into her handbag and pulled out the folded paper again. "My sister, Rebecca, is 32. She's been on dialysis for almost 2 years. The doctors say she'll need a transplant soon, but the cost is ridiculous. Insurance barely covers half. I tutor in the evenings. I waitress by day, but I'm still short by over 100 million naira, and time isn't on our side." She placed the paper between them, though her hand lingered on it like she wasn't quite ready to let go. I didn't go to beg," she added softly. "I just thought, if I could speak to the right person, maybe, just maybe, I could find someone who believes in helping." Kingston didn't speak at first. The road ahead was nearly empty now, lined with street lamps and sleeping shops. When he finally replied, his voice was steady. "Let me pay for the transplant." Zoey turned her head quickly. "What?" "I said, let me handle it," he repeated, his eyes still on the road. "No questions, no strings, just let me help." She blinked, stunned. "You can't just... Why would you do that?" He looked at her then, his voice quieter now. "Because you saved my son's life. Because you brought joy back into his eyes. Because tonight, you walked into a world that tried to chew you up, and you still stood tall." Zoey's lips trembled. "I can't take your money. I don't want charity." Kingston nodded slowly. "That's what I thought you'd say, which is why I have another offer." He pulled over gently, turning off the engine. They were parked near a quiet junction in Ikoyi, the soft lights casting a warm glow across the dashboard. He turned to face her fully. "Kevin's nanny is retiring soon," he said. "She's been wonderful, but Kevin doesn't open up to people easily. He doesn't laugh with anyone the way he did with you tonight." Zoey's brows furrowed. "What are you saying?" "I want you to come work for us," Kingston said. "Stay in the guest house at my estate in Banana Island. Be there for Kevin after school. A few hours a day. Nothing more than that." Zoey stared at him. I'll pay you well, he added. Not out of pity, out of value. You're good with him. You give him something no staff has, safety. She leaned back in the seat, her fingers tightening around the strap of her handbag. Live in Banana Island? Work for one of Nigeria's most powerful CEOs? It sounded like fiction, but the image of Rebecca in their shared apartment, hooked to a noisy dialysis machine, wouldn't leave her. This wasn't a handout. It was an opportunity. And deep down, she wanted to say yes. You don't have to decide now, Kingston said, sensing her storm of emotion. Think about it. Sleep on it. If the answer is no, I'll respect that. Zoey looked out the window. The city felt still, like it too was waiting for her answer. She turned back to him. I'll try, she whispered. For Kevin, for Rebecca, for myself. Kingston nodded, his eyes holding a softness she hadn't seen earlier. I'll have everything arranged, he said gently. The driver turned onto the street in Mushin a few minutes later. Zoey's small apartment building loomed at the corner, a place far removed from the glimmering towers of Victoria Island, but still filled with the grit that had raised her. As she stepped out of the car, Kingston rolled down the window. Good night, Zoey. She met his eyes. Good night, Kingston. The car pulled away, its headlights dissolving into the night. Zoey stood for a moment under the orange street lamp, holding that single sheet of paper in her trembling heart. Maybe, just maybe, her story was about to change. The guest house on Kingston Danjuma's Banana Island estate looked like something out of a travel magazine. Cream walls, floor-to-ceiling glass windows, a private garden filled with hibiscus and sunflowers, and the faint scent of jasmine that lingered in the morning air. Zoey Obika had never stepped foot inside a compound like this, much less lived in one. Her modest apartment in Mushin suddenly felt like a forgotten relic from another life. This wasn't just another job. It was an entirely new world. She stood barefoot by the wide bay window on her first morning there, watching the private lake shimmer in the distance. The silence felt strange. No car horns, no market women shouting, no upstairs neighbors fighting about water bills. Instead, just birdsong and peace. She had arrived the night before with only a small suitcase in her battered handbag. Kingston had arranged everything. Her room was pre-stocked with fresh linen, a journal, herbal teas, and a little welcome note signed simply, for Kevin, but also for you. K. She folded it neatly and tucked it into the back of her Bible. Her work began after breakfast. A chauffeur picked Kevin up from school and brought him home around 2 p.m. Her job, spend a few hours playing, reading, helping with homework until Kingston got back from his Victoria Island office. It sounded simple, but Kevin made it feel easy. From the moment he stepped into the guest house holding a plastic dinosaur and grinning like he'd found treasure, Zoey's heart melted. He pulled her into the garden without a second thought, dragging a small shovel and yelling, "Let's go find buried gold." "You're the knight," he said, strapping an old red scarf around her neck like a cape. "And I'm the superhero." They dug holes, got dirt on their elbows, and filled the flower beds with clues. Zoey laughed more that day than she had in months. Each afternoon followed the same rhythm. Kevin, adventure, stories, snacks, hugs. And then Kingston would arrive. Always sharp, always on time. Sometimes in navy suits, other times in caftans that made him look like a prince from a political dynasty. He'd walk through the main house's hallway and pause, just a moment, to watch them from the kitchen doorway. He never interrupted, but he always watched. And in those silent glances, Zoey sensed something unspoken. One Friday evening, after a thunderstorm had kissed the Banana Island pavement and left everything fresh, Zoey was in the kitchen helping Kevin decorate burnt cookies. The whole counter was covered in flour and laughing fingerprints. She didn't hear Kingston come in. "Is that edible?" he asked suddenly from the doorway, brow arched. Zoey jumped slightly and turned, face flushed. "Barely." Kevin grinned. "It's for you, Daddy. Your favorite, chocolate chip. But I think we burnt them." Kingston picked one up, sniffed it, and bit off a corner. His expression twisted. Then he laughed, a real, deep laugh that lit up the room. "I've had worse," he said. "Much worse." Zoe blinked, surprised. She hadn't seen him laugh like that before. "You don't have to clean this mess," he added. "We have a housekeeper." "I know," Zoe replied, wiping her hands on a napkin. "But Kevin wanted to do it himself. I just assisted with the minor disasters." Kingston walked farther in, sleeves rolled up now, and reached for a glass of water. "I haven't seen him this happy in years," he said, voice softer now. "Not since everything happened." Zoe looked at him, sensing the shift. "You can stay for dinner," he said. "I ordered from a little Italian place nearby. Kevin would be upset if you disappear now." She hesitated, but then Kevin peeked over the kitchen counter. "Please, Miss Zoe, stay. We'll eat pasta and watch cartoons." She smiled while I saw. "All right, but only if I get the last cookie." "Deal," Kevin shouted. That evening, they sat at a long dining table bathed in golden chandelier light. Zoe wore a borrowed cotton dress from the estate's wardrobe closet. Kevin chattered endlessly about school, his plastic dinosaurs, and his dream of becoming a superhero chef policeman. Halfway through the meal, Kevin grew sleepy. His little head drooped on Zoe's shoulder. His breath evened out. Kingston gently picked him up and carried him upstairs, whispering something Zoe couldn't hear. When he returned, he poured 2 glasses of red wine and took the seat beside her, as the silence was comfortable now. "You're really good with him," Kingston said quietly, swirling his wine. Zoe looked down. "I don't know what I'm doing most of the time." "You're doing more than you realize." She sipped the wine, letting it warm her chest. Then, without meaning to, the words fell out. "When Rebecca and I lost our parents, I was 18. She did everything. Paid the bills, kept me in school. Now she's sick and I can't seem to give back enough." Kingston watched her carefully. "You've already done more than most people would." Zoe shook her head. "Some days I feel like I'm drowning, smiling through it, just to survive." Kingston was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I used to think success meant having it all. Business, money, a name that mattered. But after my divorce, I realized I had everything except peace." He looked at her. "Kevin lost more than just a mother. He lost stability. I tried to replace it with tutors, nannies, expensive therapists." Zoe met his eyes. "And what helped?" "You," he said simply. She blinked. "Me?" "You remind him what safety looks like. You remind me what warmth feels like." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full, heavy, honest. "I'm just trying to do the right thing," Zoe whispered. "You are," Kingston said, voice low. "And not just for Kevin. For me too." They didn't touch. They didn't kiss. But something passed between them, like a door opening. A slow shift of hearts turning toward each other. Later that night, as Zoe returned to the guest house, she paused at the doorway, turned to look at the main house where soft lights still glowed. A storm had once brought her here. Now, she wasn't sure she ever wanted to leave. For a while, life in Banana Island felt like a beautiful dream that Zoey Obika was slowly getting used to. Each day followed a quiet rhythm. Mornings were filled with tea and walks through the garden. Afternoons with Kevin reading storybooks, building Lego towers, or painting superheroes on cardboard. And evenings, those were where something subtle began to grow. Gentle, quiet conversations with Kingston Denjuma, sometimes in the kitchen, sometimes by the private lake, always real. But the world outside that estate hadn't forgotten her. It watched, and it waited. The storm arrived on a Friday. Zoe had just bent to tie Kevin's shoelaces outside his school in Ikoyi, her laughter soft as he tried to convince her that socks made him slower. The sun was kind that morning, the air warm. She didn't see the SUV at first. It pulled up with the grace of money and menace, sleek, black, and silent. The door opened, and a pair of blood-red stilettos hit the pavement. Then legs, then a designer sheath dress, then oversized sunglasses, her presence like chilled perfume, cold, deliberate, expensive. Ariana Blackwell. She pulled off her shades slowly, revealing her sharp eyes, icy and assessing. Her voice dripped with elegance, every word coated in venom, disguised as velvet. So you're the one causing all this noise? Zoey straightened instinctively, her body tense. I'm just here to drop Kevin off. Ariana's gaze swept over her. Flat sandals, soft dress, braids tied back in a loose bun, and curled into a smug smile. You're Zoey Obika, right? The waitress turned. What exactly? Babysitter? Nanny? Mistress? Zoey felt heat rise in her cheeks, but refused to let Ariana see her flinch. I'm just doing my job, she said quietly, and taking care of Kevin. Ariana's smile widened, predatory now. Oh, I know what you're doing. Trust me, darling. All of Lagos knows. Waitress crashes Billionaire Gala. Page 6 was a delight. Her words were sharp and meant to cut. And they did. Zoey stiffened, holding Kevin's hand tightly. You see, Ariana continued, stepping closer, you may have charmed Kingston, but I see through you. I've seen women like you, desperate, pretty, and playing Cinderella in rented shoes. Kevin looked up at Zoey, confused. Miss Zoey, who is she? Before Zoey could reply, Ariana crouched slightly to Kevin's level. I used to be very close to your daddy, she said sweetly, before this girl showed up. Zoey stepped between them immediately, her voice firm. Kevin, let's head inside. Ariana rose again, smile gone now. I'll make this clear once, she hissed under her breath. Leave while you still have a shred of dignity, because if you don't, I will make sure everything in your life is destroyed, publicly, brutally, and permanently. Zoey didn't reply. She simply took Kevin's hand and walked him into the school building. But the shaking didn't stop until she was back in the guest house, doors locked behind her. That evening, her phone buzzed, notifications piling up like a flood. She unlocked it and stared at the screen in horror. Is Kingston Danjuma secretly married to a waitress? The mystery woman at the Danjuma Gala. Who is she really? From pancakes to penthouse, inside the sudden rise of Zoey Obika. The images were worse. Blurry shots of her and Kingston from the gala, a photo of her holding Kevin's hand at a supermarket, even one of her outside the guest house. She felt sick. The comment sections were a war zone. She's clearly a gold digger. Look at her shoes. He's lost his mind. He'll dump her like the rest. The knife twisted deeper when she opened the X and saw that her name was trending in Nigeria. #Danjuma drama. Her past, her dignity, her family, all laid out for public consumption. She was still staring at her phone when she heard the sound. Raised voices. From the main house. She stepped out just in time to hear Kingston in his study, his voice angrier than she'd ever heard it. Shut it down. I don't care what the board says. He snapped into the phone. This has nothing to do with company policy. It's my personal life. If I see one more headline, I'll sue everyone involved. He emerged moments later, his expression still stormy. But when he saw her standing there, his shoulders dropped just slightly. You saw it, he said, not as a question. Zoey nodded, holding back the welling tears. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't even want. I know, he said gently. She swallowed. Maybe I should go. Kingston's jaw tensed. Leave? Over this nonsense? I'm hurting your reputation, she said, her voice cracking. People are calling me a gold digger. Maybe Ariana's right. Kingston stepped closer. She's never right. But I don't belong here, Zoey whispered. I'm just a girl who used to serve plantain and beans. I've never even left the country. I've never owned a designer bag. These people, they'll never accept me. And Kevin, he doesn't deserve to be dragged into scandal. Kingston's eyes darkened. And you think you deserve to be humiliated? She turned away, her heart pounding. I can't be the reason you lose everything. There was a long silence. Then quietly he asked, Is that what you think you are? A liability? She didn't answer. That night, when the estate was silent, Zoey quietly packed her things in the guest house. She placed a single note on the small table near the door. Thank you for giving me and Rebecca something that felt like family, even for a moment. I'm leaving to protect you both. Zoey. Then she called a cab and slipped out into the night, back toward Mushin. The quiet hum of the city followed her as tears blurred her view of the road. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a photo of Kevin's drawing from earlier that day. Him, her, and Kingston, holding hands. She closed her eyes and let the tears fall. She had walked away before. But this time it didn't feel like survival. It felt like loss. Back in her small apartment in Mushin, the familiar sounds returned. Generators humming, voices shouting from street below, the distant honk of Okadas zipping through traffic. But for Zoey Obika, it all felt hollow. She sat by the window with a steaming cup of ginger tea, watching the Lagos night blur into black. The air was heavy with humidity and regret. She'd told herself she was doing the right thing, that walking away from Kingston and Kevin was an act of selflessness, a way to protect them from scandal and scrutiny. But every passing hour made her question if she had done it out of fear instead, fear of not being enough, of being exposed. Inside, the soft beeping of Rebecca's dialysis machine filled the silence. Her sister was sleeping now, her breathing shallow but steady. She'd been so proud when Zoey got the Banana Island job, and Zoey had told her only part of the truth. That night, she tried to sleep, but couldn't. She stared at the ceiling and thought of Kevin's little voice saying, "We're a family now." But families don't leave without saying goodbye. At the Danjuma estate, things unraveled quickly. Kingston hadn't been the same since the note. He read it every night. He stared at the guest house from his balcony like it might magically light up again. Kevin, once vibrant and full of chatter, had turned unusually quiet. He refused to eat the cereal Zoey used to make, tossed aside the bedtime stories they used to read, and avoided the new nanny altogether. He didn't cry. He withdrew. And then he vanished. It happened on a rainy Wednesday. Kingston was in a board meeting when the call came from the school. "Sir, Kevin is missing. He slipped out during recess. We've locked the gates and called the police." Kingston didn't think. He left everything behind. Laptop, briefcase, protocols. His driver could barely keep up. He called every place Kevin had ever liked. The Banana Island Park, the toy store at Palms, the cupcake shop in Lecky. But something tugged at his gut. Brooklyn Cafe. That's what Kevin had overheard Zoey talk about once. A cozy, old-fashioned place in Yaba she used to visit with Rebecca. Kevin had begged to go for a cupcake. They never made it. Now Kingston gripped the wheel and turned onto the third mainland bridge himself, ignoring every call that came through. At Rosie's Cafe in Yaba, Zoey was behind the counter refilling napkin holders. The rain poured outside, soft jazz playing from the radio. She hadn't told anyone she'd come back, just quietly resumed her old shift, like Banana Island had never happened. Then the bell above the cafe door rang. She turned, and her heart stopped. Kevin. Soaked from head to toe, his yellow raincoat clung to his small frame. Water dripped from his curls. His eyes were wide and tear-filled. "Miss Zoey," he choked out. "I looked everywhere." She rushed to him, dropping everything, kneeling and wrapping him in her arms. "Oh my God, Kevin, what are you doing here? Are you okay?" She checked him over, her hands trembling. "How did you get here? Does your dad know where you are?" Kevin clung to her. "I missed you. You were gone, and I was sad. I wanted to find you and bring you home." Zoey's tears spilled as she pulled him into the back booth and wrapped him in a spare apron. She gave him hot cocoa and tucked his tiny plastic dinosaur into his lap. "I'm here now," she whispered, "and I'm not going anywhere. I promise." She was about to call Kingston when the cafe door slammed open. Kingston, soaked in his tailored suit, stormed in like a man on the edge of collapse. His eyes found Kevin instantly, and then Zoey. He crossed the room in 3 steps, kneeling, scooping Kevin into his arms and holding him so tightly the boy squealed. Don't ever do that again, Kingston breathed, his voice cracked with panic. Kevin nestled against him, but his hand still gripped Zoey's. Kingston looked at her, drenched, breathless, something breaking in his expression. Do you have any idea what could have happened to him? He demanded. What if he got hurt? What if someone had taken him? I didn't know he would come here, Zoey whispered, trembling. I swear, I just found him. Just now. Kingston took a deep breath, steadying himself. The cafe was silent except for the rain tapping against the windows. He looked at Kevin, then at her, and when he finally spoke, it wasn't anger. It was something else entirely. At the gala, he said quietly, I told everyone you were my wife. It started as a lie, to protect you, to protect myself from watching you get chewed up by people who think they own the world. Zoey stood still, tears dripping from her chin. But right now, Kingston continued, standing here in a cafe that smells like burnt toast, watching you hold my son like he's your own. He stepped closer. I wish that lie were true. Zoey's breath caught. Kevin looked between them with wide, hopeful eyes. You're staying, right? You're part of us. We're a family now. Zoey knelt, cupping Kevin's face. I will never leave without saying goodbye again. I promise. She looked up at Kingston, her voice breaking. I thought leaving would protect you. I thought I wasn't enough. Kingston shook his head and took her hand. You were enough the moment Kevin smiled at you, the moment you walked into my life and didn't try to impress me. You just were. That's more than enough. The storm outside softened into a drizzle. In that tiny cafe, soaked in rain and surrounded by the scent of akara and coffee, Kingston Danjuma pulled Zoey and Kevin into his arms. Not because it was expected, but because it finally felt like home. The modest community center in Yaba was no Banana Island mansion. The floors were tiled with old ceramic squares. The plastic chairs didn't match. The fans overhead spun with a dull creak. But on a bright Sunday morning in June, it became the most beautiful place Zoey Obika had ever seen. This wasn't a society wedding. It was something softer, deeper. It was hers. The once plain hall had been transformed by hands that knew love, not wealth. Colorful Ankara buntings crisscrossed the ceiling. Bouquets of wildflowers, gathered from Freedom Park and local gardens, stood in reused soda bottles turned vases. Paper butterflies, handmade by neighborhood kids Zoey used to tutor, danced along the windows. There was no red carpet, no press, but everyone who mattered was there. Scarlett Ocon sat in the front row, wearing a lemon-yellow wrapper and crying freely. Her camera never left her hands. The regulars from Rosie's Cafe filled 3 full rows, truck drivers, older women, and students who remembered when Zoey always snuck them extra puff-puff. A few nurses from the dialysis ward came too, and of course, her sister. Rebecca Obika, beaming in a light pink gown, stood tall and radiant, now healthy post-transplant, a miracle quietly made possible by a grant from the Danjuma Foundation, one Zoey insisted she would pay back, bit by bit, with her own hands. She was the maid of honor, and she cried the hardest. Then came the ring bearer, 5-year-old Kevin Danjuma, bouncing down the aisle in a tiny white agbada, holding a box that nearly swallowed his small hands. His crooked superhero bow tie peeked out underneath. Daddy, he whispered loudly when he reached the altar. She looks like a real princess. And Kingston, standing in a simple white shirt and gray native wrapper, chuckled and nodded. That's because she is. When the doors finally opened, every head turned. Zoey stepped forward. She wore a thrifted cream lace gown she had sewn and altered herself. Delicate beads traced across her sleeves, hand-stitched over the past 2 weeks. A soft veil draped over her braids, woven by a local stylist who refused to take payment. Her bouquet? Fresh wildflowers and sunflowers tied together with the red scarf Kevin once used as a superhero cape. Every step she took down that aisle was a quiet declaration. I survived. I endured. I belong. Her eyes locked on Kingston's, and all her fears melted into the sunlight that poured through the open windows. He wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was hers. The ceremony was short, heartfelt, and officiated by the pastor who had comforted Zoey and Rebecca after their parents died. His words held no pretense, only warmth. When it was time for the vows, Zoey's voice trembled at first, but grew stronger with each word. Kingston, I vow to love you with honesty, to stand beside you as you've stood beside me, to raise Kevin with joy, and to never let fear write our future. Kingston smiled, eyes glistening. Zoey, I vow to protect your peace, to treasure the strength that saved my son, to love not just the woman you are, but the courage that lives inside you. The pastor smiled, hands raised. I now pronounce you husband and wife. Cheers erupted. Kevin squealed and ran up the aisle shouting, "We're the best family ever," before launching himself into their arms. There was no formal reception. Instead, a celebration bloomed in the community center's garden. Tables borrowed from neighbors were lined with dishes made by friends. Jollof rice, moi moi, fried plantain, suya trays, cupcakes, and a large pot of ogbono soup, courtesy of Mom and Kechi from downstairs. The drinks table featured Zobo and wine glasses and chilled Fanta, and instead of a wedding cake, they had stacked boxes of meat pies and a single vanilla sponge with "Forever Us" written in blue icing. Laughter filled the air as Kevin gave a speech, mostly about dinosaurs and his plan to become president of Nigeria. As long as Miss Zoey is my mom, Zoey and Kingston danced slowly in the garden center, surrounded by clapping hands and singing voices. The rhythm was gentle, not choreographed, not flashy, just real. Thank you, Zoey whispered as they swayed, her cheek against his chest. For everything. No, Kingston murmured, holding her tighter. Thank you for showing me that peace doesn't live in private jets or glass towers. It lives in places like this. Their dance ended with a kiss, soft, meaningful, and full of promise. As the sun dipped lower, casting amber light across the garden, Zoey slipped off her shoes and let her bare feet touch the earth. Kevin ran ahead with his superhero cape tied around his waist, chasing soap bubbles and shouting about treasure hunts. She watched him, her fingers laced with Kingston's. Everything she thought she'd lost, stability, dignity, love, had come back in a form she never expected. Not through rescue, but through choice. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned and the laughter grew softer, Kingston stood on a wooden crate to give a small speech. Everyone quieted. He looked down at Zoey, standing barefoot in a second-hand wedding dress, holding their son's hand, glowing with simplicity and grace. 2 years ago, Zoey Obika wasn't on the guest list for a gala. She walked into a world that tried to shut her out. But instead of breaking, she made it hers. He paused. Today, I didn't marry a stranger. I married the woman who saved my son's life. The woman who saved my life. The woman who taught me that love isn't about power, it's about presence. Thunderous applause filled the garden. Tears spilled. But they were happy ones. And as Zoey, Kingston, and Kevin stepped away from the crowd, toward the sunset behind the blooming trees, they didn't walk into a mansion or a spotlight. They walked into their home. No guest list, no press. Just 3 hearts, bound not by wealth, but by truth. A year had passed since the day Zoey Obika married Kingston Danjuma in a borrowed lace gown, barefoot in a Yaba garden surrounded by flowers and people who loved without conditions. Their life now was quiet, but full. The Danjuma estate in Banana Island remained as grand as ever, but inside it no longer felt like a polished museum. It had become a home. Kevin's drawings hung proudly on the fridge. Braille books lined the shelf in the hallway, and tiny superhero capes lay forgotten in the living room after long days of play. There were still whispers from the outside world. Critics, gossip blogs, whispers at board meetings. But inside these walls, there was laughter. There was peace. Zoey sat in the garden that afternoon, dressed in a soft wrapper, her braids tied back, and a little baby asleep on her chest. Amara, just 4 weeks old, she had already stolen every heart in the house, including Kevin's. Kevin, now 6, raced across the lawn with his toy car and turned dramatically toward his father, who stood near the gate on a business call. "Daddy!" he shouted. "I'm faster than a Bugatti." Kingston turned, smiled, and held up 2 fingers. 2 minutes, champ! He hung up, slipped the phone into his pocket, and walked toward them. "She's still asleep?" he asked softly, crouching beside Zoey and peeking at the baby wrapped against her chest. "Barely," Zoey whispered. "She stirs every time you speak." Kingston laughed under his breath, kissing Amara's tiny forehead, then Zoey's. "I missed you today." "I'm right here," she said, smiling. "No, I mean, I missed us, this. I was sitting in that office in 6, and I kept thinking, how did I survive without you for all those years?" Zoey rested her head on his shoulder. "You were surviving. Now you're living." They sat in the quiet for a moment, the breeze rustling the trees. Kevin's laughter rang through the yard as he chased his toy car toward the fountain. "I've been thinking," Kingston said after a while. "Dangerous," Zoey teased. He smiled. "I want to start a foundation. In your name. One that helps women like you. Women who fight for their families but are too proud to ask for help." Zoey blinked. "You want to use my name?" "No," he said. "Our name. The Obika Danjuma Foundation." Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. "You saved Kevin," he said gently. "Now you'll save so many more." Zoey nodded, overwhelmed. Not just by the idea, but by the life she was living. A life that was no longer defined by struggle, but by purpose. Later that evening, the 5 of them, Kingston, Zoey, Kevin, Amara, and Rebecca, gathered around the dinner table. Rebecca had moved into a home of her own nearby, healthier than ever, and had just gotten a part-time job managing a local women's co-op. Kevin chattered excitedly about his school project, and Zoey cut up pieces of soft yam for Amara while Kingston poured glasses of Zobo. "Let's do a toast," Rebecca said suddenly, raising her glass. "To answered prayers." Zoey raised hers. "To second chances." Kingston looked around the table and raised his own. "To the family we found when we weren't even looking." They clinked glasses and the light from the chandelier danced across their faces. And somewhere in that quiet house, behind the success and headlines, between diaper bags and Lego sets and bedtime stories, they carved out a love story not built on wealth or glamour or a perfect beginning, but on grace, on truth, on the beautiful, unshakable power of coming home.